My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment. There is something you need to hear before you move on with your day, because in this fictional spiritual story, a truth has finally reached the person who never understood what you were carrying behind your silence. Your soulmate has discovered something. Something you never explained. Something you never used to gain sympathy. Something you deliberately kept hidden because you did not want your love to become a debt they were forced to repay. And now that they know, they are shocked. Not because they discovered that you cared. They already knew you cared. What shocked them was discovering how much you sacrificed while pretending that everything was fine. They are remembering moments they once misunderstood. The days when you became quiet. The conversations where you suddenly stopped arguing. The times you could have demanded answers but chose not to. The moments when you could have walked away angrily, but instead you simply stepped back. They thought you had become distant. They thought you had stopped caring. They thought your silence meant you had accepted the ending. But now they are beginning to realize something completely different. You were not silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you had too much to say. There were words inside you that could have changed everything. There were questions you wanted to ask. There were disappointments you wanted to confront. There were nights when you wanted to tell them exactly how deeply their actions had affected you. But you stopped yourself. You told yourself that if the connection was real, it should not have to survive through pressure, manipulation, guilt, or fear. So you made a decision. You would rather suffer quietly than force someone to stay somewhere their heart was not ready to stay. And your soulmate never knew that. That is why their discovery has shaken them. Because they are now looking back at the past through a completely different lens. The same memories are still there. But the meaning has changed. They remember you stepping away. Now they wonder what you were feeling when you did it. They remember your short replies. Now they wonder how many longer messages you typed and deleted. They remember your patience. Now they wonder how many times you were actually hurting. They remember you saying, "It's okay." Now they are asking themselves whether it was ever really okay. And that question is becoming impossible for them to ignore. Because your silence was never empty. It was full of things you chose not to place on their shoulders. You sacrificed the need to be immediately understood. You sacrificed the satisfaction of proving that you were right. You sacrificed the opportunity to make them feel guilty. And perhaps most importantly, you sacrificed your desire to control the outcome. You could have chased. You could have demanded. You could have tried to make them jealous. You could have reminded them of everything you had done. But you refused. Not because you were weak. Because somewhere inside you, you understood that love cannot be forced into existence. If someone chooses you because they are afraid of losing you, that is not the kind of victory you wanted. You wanted to be chosen freely. You wanted them to see your value without being threatened by your absence. And that choice cost you more than they ever knew. There were nights when you almost gave up. You remember them. You remember lying awake, staring into the darkness, wondering whether you were wasting your heart on someone who might never understand it. You remember checking your phone. You remember hoping for a message. You remember telling yourself not to expect anything. And then checking again anyway. You remember the strange pain of missing someone while simultaneously trying to convince yourself that you did not need them. You remember how exhausting it became. And yet, somehow, you remain gentle. That is what they are discovering now. Your soulmate is realizing that your strength was not the absence of pain. Your strength was the way you carried pain without allowing it to turn you into someone cruel. You had every reason to become bitter. But you chose not to. You had every reason to expose what happened. But you chose privacy. You had every reason to make them suffer because you had suffered. But you chose peace. And now they are asking themselves why. Why would someone who was hurt so deeply still protect the person who hurt them? Why would someone who felt forgotten continue to care? Why would someone who had every opportunity to demand recognition choose silence instead? The answer is simple. Because you never wanted your sacrifices to become chains around their heart. You wanted love, not obligation. You wanted connection, not control. And they are finally beginning to understand the difference. Something inside them has changed. They may not show it immediately. They may not suddenly appear at your door. They may not know how to explain what they are feeling. But internally, something has shifted. They are replaying the past. They are remembering conversations. They are remembering your face. They are remembering moments when you looked like you wanted to say something but didn't. And now they wonder what those unsaid words were. They are realizing there were entire chapters of your emotional life they never read. They knew the version of you that smiled. They knew the version of you that said everything was fine. They knew the version of you that showed up. But they did not know the version of you that went home afterward and quietly fell apart. That version remained hidden. And perhaps that was your greatest sacrifice. You protected them from seeing how much power their actions had over your emotions. You didn't want them to feel responsible for every tear. You didn't want to become emotionally dependent on their attention. So you learned to carry yourself. You learned to comfort yourself. You learned to wait without demanding. You learned to love without chasing. And somewhere along that journey, you became stronger than the person you were when this connection first began. Your soulmate is discovering that transformation now. And it is shocking because they thought you were simply moving away from them. They did not realize you were moving toward yourself. You were learning who you were without their validation. You were learning that your worth could not be measured by whether someone replied to your message. You were learning that being loved by someone else is beautiful, but being able to stand securely within yourself is necessary. And that lesson changed the entire connection. Because once you stopped trying to force an outcome, something unexpected happened. You became peaceful. Not because you stopped caring. Because you stopped fighting reality. You accepted that you could love someone and still release the need to control their choices. You could miss someone and still continue living. You could hope for reconciliation without putting your entire life on pause. You could remember them without abandoning yourself. And that is what your soulmate is struggling to understand now. They are realizing that the person they once thought was waiting for them may no longer be waiting in the same way. You have changed. You still have feelings. But your feelings no longer control your entire existence. And that realization creates a different kind of urgency inside them. Because suddenly, they understand that your patience was not an unlimited resource. You gave it freely. But it was never guaranteed forever. They are asking themselves whether they waited too long. Whether they misunderstood too much. Whether they assumed you would always be available. Whether they mistook your kindness for certainty. And those questions are painful. But they are necessary. Because sometimes people do not understand the value of someone's presence until they realize that presence was a choice. You chose them. You were never trapped by them. You could have walked away. You could have closed the door. You could have allowed anger to become your final answer. But you didn't. And now they know. That is why their shock is so deep. They have discovered that while they were trying to understand your behavior from the outside, you were fighting an entirely different battle inside. You were deciding what kind of person you wanted to become because of the connection. Would you become bitter? Or would you become wiser? Would you punish? Or would you release? Would you chase? Or would you allow free choice? Would you destroy what once mattered because you were hurt? Or would you honor yourself enough to walk away without hatred? You chose the harder path. And now they are seeing it. But there is something else they discovered. Something that may hurt them even more. They realized that there were opportunities when you could have moved towards someone else. You could have distracted yourself. You could have replaced the connection. You could have accepted attention from people who were willing to give you what you were missing. But you didn't rush. You refused to use another person as medicine for an old wound. You chose to heal instead. And that was another sacrifice. You sacrificed immediate comfort for emotional honesty. You sacrificed temporary attention for long-term peace. You sacrificed the satisfaction of proving that you could replace them. And nobody knew. Nobody saw that internal decision. Nobody congratulated you. But you made it. And your soulmate is beginning to understand that now. They are realizing that while they were living their life, you were making decisions that quietly protected your future self. That is why this revelation feels so personal. It is not merely about what you did for them. It is about what you refused to do to yourself. You refused to become desperate for love. You refused to lose your dignity just to keep a connection alive. You refused to beg someone to recognize what you already knew about your own heart. And eventually, something inside you became calm. You stopped asking, when will they choose me? You started asking, will I still choose myself if they don't? That question changed everything. Because for the first time, you understood that loving someone should never require abandoning yourself. And that is the truth your soulmate is finally seeing. Perhaps they thought your silence meant you had stopped loving them. Now they understand that your silence may have been the most disciplined expression of love you were capable of giving. You were saying, without words, I will not force you. I will not manipulate you. I will not punish you. I will not turn my pain into your prison. But I also will not destroy myself waiting forever. That balance is powerful. And now they are standing face to face with the consequences of not recognizing it sooner. They are not necessarily afraid of losing you because they suddenly discovered you were perfect. They are afraid because they finally understand that you were real. Your love was not a performance. Your patience was not a strategy. Your silence was not a game. Your distance was not necessarily rejection. You were simply trying to protect your heart while leaving room for the connection to breathe. And now they want to know whether that room still exists. That is the question growing inside them. But before they can answer it, they have to confront something else. Regret. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that appears when they remember something they said years ago. The kind that appears when they realize you were trying to communicate and they were not listening. The kind that arrives when they remember treating something casually that meant everything to you. They may suddenly remember your patience. Your small gestures. Your willingness to understand. The way you remember details they had forgotten. The way you showed concern without making a performance out of it. The way you stayed kind even when you were disappointed. And now those memories are becoming evidence. Evidence that you cared more deeply than they understood. They are beginning to ask themselves whether they ever truly thanked you. Whether they ever recognized your effort. Whether they ever told you that they noticed. And perhaps the most painful question is this. What if they stopped trying because they finally became tired of being the only one trying? That thought can change a person. Because suddenly, the silence no longer looks like abandonment. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like someone who had reached the point where love could no longer survive entirely on hope. And that is where your soulmate's shock becomes something deeper. It becomes respect. They may finally respect the strength it took for you to step back. They may finally understand that walking away without hatred requires more courage than staying and complaining. They may finally understand that you did not leave because you did not care. You stepped back because you cared about yourself too. And that distinction matters. Because your story was never supposed to be about proving that someone needed you. It was about discovering that you could love deeply without disappearing inside someone else's life. You learned that. And now they are learning it too. The person who once wondered why you became quiet is now wondering what your silence protected. The person who once assumed you were fine is now wondering what you endured. The person who once thought you would always be there is now wondering whether they still have a place in your future. And that is the emotional turning point. Because the truth has reached them. Not as punishment. Not as revenge. As recognition. They now know that there was a cost behind your calmness. There was a story behind your silence. There was strength behind your restraint. There was love behind your decision not to force anything. And there was pain behind the moments when you said nothing. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this fictional story is that your sacrifices did not disappear. They changed you. They taught you patience without teaching you weakness. They taught you love without teaching you dependence. They taught you forgiveness without teaching you to tolerate everything. They taught you hope without requiring you to abandon reality. And now you stand differently. You are not the same person who first entered this connection. You have grown. You have learned. You have healed parts of yourself you once thought would remain wounded forever. And if your soulmate returns to your life, they will not be meeting the old version of you. They will be meeting someone who knows their worth. Someone who can love without begging. Someone who can forgive without forgetting. Someone who can open their heart without handing over control of it. And perhaps that is what they are most shocked by. They thought your greatest sacrifice was staying. They are beginning to realize your greatest sacrifice was becoming strong enough to leave if necessary. That realization changes the balance completely. Because now, if they come closer, it cannot be because you chased them. It cannot be because you convinced them. It cannot be because you made them afraid. It has to be because they finally see. They finally understand. They finally choose. And that is the kind of choice your heart wanted all along. Not forced. Not manipulated. Not demanded. Chosen. Freely. Completely. Honestly. So if you have ever wondered whether your silent sacrifices mattered, remember this fictional message. Not every sacrifice produces immediate recognition. Some sacrifices first transform the person making them. You became wiser. You became calmer. You became stronger. You learned boundaries. You learned patience. You learned that love can be deep without being destructive. And now someone who once misunderstood you is beginning to see that transformation. Your soulmate has discovered what you sacrificed in silence. And they are shocked because they finally understand something they could not see before. You were never asking them to rescue you. You were simply hoping that one day they would recognize the heart that had been standing quietly in front of them. And now, they are recognizing it. The past cannot be rewritten. The moments that hurt cannot be erased. The words that were never spoken cannot suddenly appear. But understanding can change what comes next. And your soulmate is standing at that exact emotional doorway. Behind them is the version of the story they believed. In front of them is the truth they have only just discovered. They know what you sacrificed. They know what you endured. They know what you chose not to say. And now they are asking themselves one final question. A question that is far more powerful than, do I still love them? The question is, if they were willing to sacrifice so much without asking me for anything in return, what am I willing to do now that I finally understand? That is where everything changes. Because the next chapter cannot be written by your silence alone. It requires a choice from them. And for the first time, they are beginning to understand that the person they once thought would always wait is now standing peacefully in their own life. Still capable of love. Still capable of forgiveness. Still capable of opening the door. but no longer willing to abandon themselves just to keep that door open. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all. Your sacrifice was never meant to prove that you needed them. It was meant to reveal how deeply you could love while still learning to love yourself. Your soulmate finally sees that. And somewhere inside them, beneath all the confusion, regret, memories, and shock, something very simple is beginning to form. Recognition. They finally see you. Not the version they imagined. Not the version they misunderstood. Not the version created by distance. They see the person behind the silence. The person who waited without demanding. The person who hurt without becoming cruel. The person who cared without controlling. The person who stepped back without hatred. The person who chose dignity when nobody was watching. And now they understand why your silence felt different. Because it was never empty. It was carrying a love they were simply not mature enough to recognize at the time. Now they know. And whether this connection becomes a new beginning, a final closure, or something neither of you expected, one truth remains within this fictional story. What you sacrificed in silence was not wasted. It became part of the person you are today. And when someone finally understands the price you paid without ever asking them to pay it back, they can never look at your silence the same way again. So breathe. Let the past remain where it belongs. You do not need to chase recognition. You do not need to explain every sacrifice. You do not need to convince anyone of your heart. Sometimes the deepest truth arrives on its own. And in this story, it has finally arrived. Your soulmate knows. They know what you gave. They know what you endured. They know what you chose. And they are shocked. Because they finally understand that while they were wondering why you became silent, you were quietly becoming someone they would never be able to forget.